Part 2, defining political organizations. Here is the standard. Pause and read it. So we're going to be covering a lot of this, and it's pretty straightforward. So we start off pretty easy in this class, I think. So we're going to be talking a lot about the political systems that comprise the AP6. So in this class, we are looking at China, the People's Republic of China, Mexico, the Iranian Republic, the Russian Federation, Nigeria, and who did I forget? United Kingdom? I don't think I said them yet. United Kingdom. So those are the 6 countries that we study. So we are looking at kind of basic terminology that will allow us to have kind of a common language of talking about the governments that exist within the countries. Okay, so we're going to be looking at 6 terms, and you'll see these in the outline. They are states, regimes, nation, sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy. All right, let's talk states. So 4 things really to be a state. Maybe oversimplifying, but in general, in order to be so state, first of all, I should say, is basically in this class and in political science lingo, the word state is like a synonym for the word country. Okay, so in this class, we are going to call countries states. That'll take a few days to get used to, but you'll get used to it, I think. So what does it take to be a state? Well, permanent population, so a group of people that permanently live there, a government having defined and delineated territory, and then having international recognition. Other people think you're states, voila, you're a state. So all 6 of the states that we talk about in this class are states. And I have a term here that I think is a useful way to think about states. I didn't come up with it, but it's a kind of a famous political science term. It's the term is monopoly of violence, thinking that within a state, the government or the state itself are basically the sole force or the sole operator that can use violence, like policing power and things like that within the state. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at a lot in this class is what are the challenges to the authority and to the legitimacy of some of these states that we look at, particularly when we look at states like Mexico and Nigeria and even Russia. And yeah, all right, cool. So that might leave a question. What do we call things like Mexico? So Mexico, like the US, calls its states, right? So what do we call them? So the fancy term, or the one that I'll probably say, is the term sub-state units, but you can also just call them Mexican states. I won't tell anybody. All right. The next one, regimes. So the term state refers to basically the political entity itself. The term regime means the political institutions and systems with access to an exercise of political power. So essentially, who is running the country? The regime is. And the word regime has a bad rap. It has, conjures up Stalin and stuff. But the word regime basically means any group of people that has access to, or any system with access to an exercise of political power. So basically, who is running the country? So an example would be the system of one-party governance by the CCP in China, or the Chinese Communist Party in China. So China not really elects. China selects new leaders, and the president changes, but the regime doesn't, from person to person. So the way that we refer to regime change is when the entire system of government changes. Everything changes, not everything, but most things change. So change in the system of government that fundamentally alters the governance pattern of the country. And I made up that definition. I think it's a good one, but that just came from my head. So for example, like when a change happens within a country that fundamentally alters the system of government. So thinking about the AP6, we have lots and lots and lots and lots of cool examples of regime changes in here. So I would say when the Soviet Union fell and the Russian Federation was created, and that was kind of a multi-year process, but kind of Russia at the end of the Soviet Union from 1991 to 1993. So Mexico kind of gradually crept toward democracy. and finally made the final leap in 2000 with a legitimate election. So that marked kind of the end of a one-party system throughout the 20th century for Mexico. The Iranian Revolution, which resulted in kind of the installation of a religious theocracy with some really interesting kind of democratic components, but that was fundamentally altered the regime itself. Nigeria's had lots and lots and lots of regime changes. The most recent regime change, I think, was in 1994. No, sorry, 1999. And the Chinese last regime change in China was the victory of the Chinese Communist Party over the nationalist forces in the installation of a communist government in China in 1949. So essentially, when the system of government changes, and we did mention the UK because they haven't really had much of a regime change, and we'll talk about that when we get to them. All right, next word, nations. So I like the definition of the College Board. So I'm going to use theirs. A group of people with commonalities including race, language, religion, ethnicity, political identity, and aspirations. So notice there can be more than one nation inside of a state. So for example, we have the Irish within England. We have the Welsh, we have the Scottish, we have other groups, and they are all nations that exist within the United Kingdom. I said within England, I meant within the United Kingdom. We also have the English. They're probably the biggest nation within. Iran has mostly Iranian, kind of the Iranian nation, but they also have some minority groups within it, like Azerbaijani and Armenian. Kind of those nations exist, and Kurdish nation, kind of the Kurdish people as well. And then Russia. Russia is probably the best example of a multinational state within the AP6. So there are lots and lots of interesting political units within Russia, and a lot of those comprise kind of nations. So about 77% of Russia, of the Russian population, are actually ethnically Russian. And the remaining 23% belong to kind of the other nations that exist within Russia. All right, last term, last slide. 3 terms here. I just have the definitions for each because I want to talk a little bit about them initially. So we have 3 terms: sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy. So sovereignty refers to the right and power to govern. So for a country, the right and power to govern itself without outside interference. So whether or not a country has legal authority over the population in a defined territory. So sovereignty goes really, really hand in hand with that idea of like international recognition that we talked about when we talked about states. So is a country sovereign? That depends on whether or not it's a state. So if you're a state, you're sovereign, basically. And the other 2 terms kind of go together really well: authority and legitimacy. So authority refers to the government's right to make decisions and exercise control. So basically, who is in charge of the country, and do they have the right to make decisions and exercise control over the entire country, or do they just have authority over parts of the country? There are some examples of that we'll talk about within the AP6. So, and the last term is legitimacy. So whether or not a government's constituents, or the people that live within, believe their government has the right to wield power the way they do. So legitimacy is oftentimes a tricky thing to look at. We'll use this term a lot and talk about how things affect the legitimacy of countries. Basically, the government's functioning in the eyes of its citizens. All right, see ya.